Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Andy McAfee, author of The Geek Way, which is about what makes the West Coast geeks special when it comes to innovation. Andy is a principal research scientist at MIT and co-founder and co-director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy at the Sloan School of Management. Andy, I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about why the geeks are taking over the world. So welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Andy, we've known each other a long time, but I figured I don't know much about you other than professionally. So, you were a professor at Harvard when we got to know each other, and then you went to MIT. But go back a little bit, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Give me a little guidance. What kinds of things would you think you and your listeners would like to know?
Anything you find interesting. So I'll leave that entirely up to you.
See, the problem, and the more I go, the more I believe this, is that we find ourselves too interesting. We're way too caught up in our own awesomeness. Like, I talk about this a little bit in The Geek Way. And one of the reasons I think The Geek Way is really successful is that it provides a check or a series of checks on our overconfidence, our self-centeredness, things like that. So even though, I certainly love talking about myself, I really don't like to do it because I think that it's a trap.
Okay, so in that case, let me lead you gently into the trap. So,
I can't say I wasn't warned.
Yeah, indeed. So, what do you say were the biggest influences in your life growing up? Like when you were like a kid, like 10 to 13. I mean, people sometimes ask me that, and I have no
10 to
problem.
13.
Yeah, just in that.
It's such a great age, right? Because it's right before hormones take over your existence. And it's kind of this last period of more innocent enthusiasms in your life. So back then, 10 to 13, I think my main things were baseball, both watching the Chicago Cubs, which was my hometown team, and playing it very poorly, and just reading books and science fiction. And that was a little bit too young. By the time I was maybe 11 or 12, these things called personal computers had appeared. And I remember that I had a neighbor who got an old Radio Shack TRS-80, and they let me come over once in a while and mess around on it. And I just thought it was the most amazing device I'd ever seen in my life. So I think there are some roots of my geekiness there. Tons of sci-fi and very early computers.
So you just started programming on those machines in BASIC or something like that?
There was some basic programming going on. They were playing very early ASCII-based video games. Hopefully most of your viewers are young enough to have no idea what we're talking about. But these weird text-based games that you could play, there's like an early version of Pong and maybe Space Invaders, just, stuff like that.
And how did you make your way into tech? Was that just like a natural segue, or did it require some thinking?
It's probably more randomness and luck than anything else. After I got out of my master's programs and I worked for a couple of years, I realized that I was kind of bored and I didn't really like it very much. And I went back to school. I went to Harvard Business School and I did my doctorate there. And I started in 1994. And that was a very important year in the history of computing, because the first web browsers, the first kind of widely available web browsers, came out in 94. And we became aware that there was already this global network of computers that suddenly became much, much easier to access and use. So that was a big deal. The early to mid 90s were also when companies really started to ramp up their spending on what we now call enterprise technology. There are these old ERP systems. So the amount of money that companies were devoting to digital stuff just started to skyrocket right about in the mid 90s. So I showed up looking for a thing to study. You probably remember being a doctoral student. You look around for a thing to study, and there was this very obvious thing sitting right there that I was interested in anyway. So it just felt very natural.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the 90s were a pretty amazing period. In fact, I'd been a professor already for about 10 years, and I went to Morgan Stanley, where I I did. I brought machine learning to Wall Street at Morgan Stanley. And the weird thing is that that's when the internet was emerging. And to me, it seemed like machine learning was just around the corner, right? It was just like, this is so obvious that it's around the corner. Organizations were really more focused on the internet at that time. And I remember Netscape coming out. And in fact, Morgan Stanley took Netscape public.
Oh, wow.
So that was, I was right in the middle of that.
And it turns out you were just about, you're a decade ahead of your time, or maybe a little more, with the machine learning revolution. Like you say, it took time. And I think you and a lot of your colleagues probably just underestimated the scale that was necessary to realize a lot of the visions that you had for the technology.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, it was the scale, but it was also, I don't think human beings were ready for it yet. I mean, human beings tend to be herd mentality people. And as much as I tried to tell people that this was right there, they didn't believe me. And so I just went ahead and did it anyway. I mean, I sort of set up a machine learning-based hedge fund, and I had a lot of fun doing it because there was so much low-hanging fruit. I mean, I worked with Morgan Stanley, the asset gathering part of the business, and it was so easy to sort of, find patterns in the behavior of clients and actually offer a better value proposition. So that was just like, days of low-hanging fruit, but it was frustrating because people just, I just wondered, like, why don't people get it? So there was a lot of resistance from academics too, by the way. People in finance, economics, like very resistant to anything sort of nonlinear. Yeah. So it was before its time for multiple reasons. The technology was kind of not quite there. You required a lot more infrastructure. Plus, there was resistance from people.
It reminds me of the great Paul Graham quote where he says, "Don't worry about people stealing your good idea. If it's actually a good idea, you'll have to ram it down their throats."
Yeah, for sure. But by the way, in your book with Eric, The Second Machine Age, that the timing was just absolutely spot on.
We caught a wave.
Yeah, exactly. The world was ready for it. In fact, I'm now tempted to write a book called The Third Machine Age.
Do it. Do it. Catch the next wave. Yeah, Eric and I mean, it's a good book. I'm happy with the book.
It's a great book, yeah.
But we caught a wave. We were just out there on our surfboards when the tsunami came through town, right?
Indeed.
So we were talking about the subject at the time when the book came out in 2014, that finally the visions of the machine learning community were being realized, when we all had supercomputers in our pockets, when the world really was coming together for the very first time. And I think Eric and I said, "Hey, this is legitimately a big deal, and there are some very important consequences of it." And we caught the wave.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things that came to mind when I was reading your new book, the Geek Way, because you talk about the finance sector as sort of being a laggard now, and at that time it was sort of a leader in technology, in investing in basic technologies to make, just sort of lower the friction. They were giving technology to their customers. They were investing in technology themselves. So like big investors in technology and quite innovative, I thought, for their time. So it's interesting that, one of the things you note is that the financial industry now is sort of a laggard when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, in a particular sense, because as you know, the finance industry is a huge investor in technology. I forget which bank CEO talks about, he runs an IT shop with a bank attached to it. They invest like crazy because they have to. But when you ask their own employees, is your company some combination of agile, innovative, and good at execution? Finance is really one of the industries where people have the most negative views about the places where they work.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm really curious about that, and we'll come back to it. But let's go back to your latest book and tell us why you wrote it.
Because I finally got an answer to a question that had been puzzling me. And the question that had been puzzling me is, why is this thing different? And then that question got sharpened. The thing that I'm talking about is the way that primarily West Coast, primarily tech companies run themselves. Because especially after Second Machine Age came out, for the past decade, I've had this amazing good fortune where I get to spend time in each economy. And like I talk about in the book, I don't love this terminology, old economy versus new economy, Silicon Valley versus everything else, but I'm going to use it for a little while. So I spent time in each economy, and my work and my research would take me out west, take me to the Valley a lot. And I got to walk around companies and talk to the people who founded them, who were investing in them, who were working there. And then I'd go spend time at the entire rest of the economy. And they were different. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but you didn't have to spend very much time in both economies to realize that they were different and they were diverging more and more over time. And then as the years went by, it became even more clear to me that the Silicon Valley style was winning. It wasn't just that there were hoodies and foosball tables and people brought their dogs to work and that was cool. It was that it was leading to better results, and in some cases, weirdly good results. That's not, you and I are old enough to remember when Netflix was a DVD by mail company, right? I'm sure you were a customer in the late 90s, like I was, of DVDs by mail. Maybe you were more foresightful than I was, but I didn't look at that company mailing me DVDs and think this company is going to disrupt all of filmed entertainment. It's going to disrupt Hollywood. That was crazy back then. That's actually what has happened, though. So that's just one example. I talk about a lot more in the book of this something happening concentrated out in Northern California, where the companies that were being incubated and growing there were disrupting not just the classic high-tech sector, but lots and lots of different parts of the economy. And the question then for me became, what is so different here? And the first set of answers is one that I've got over and over again, which is, look, high tech requires different strategies. It requires that you understand network effects and the implications of Moore's law and platform strategies. And I believe all of that. All that is true. The problem with that explanation, though, is that you and I and Eric and tons of other people have been teaching about these aspects of the digital economy for decades. This is not news. I don't talk to executive teams who are unaware of network effects and platform businesses and all those things. So it's not like Silicon Valley was the only part of the world that was aware of these phenomenon. They did seem to be by far the part of the world that was best at harnessing these phenomenon. So that wasn't, to me, a strategy explanation. That wasn't the explanation for what was going on. And as much as I hated to admit it to myself, the word culture is the right word to describe what's going on here. These places just have a different philosophy and a different set of practices about how they get stuff done, how they run the company. Now, so that was the puzzle. And the puzzle was, why is what they're doing working so much better? And then for me, the answer to that puzzle came from other reading that I'd been doing, other stuff that I was exposed to that goes by a bunch of different labels. I'll use the label cultural evolution. And the way I like to think about it is it's as if a bunch of alien anthropologists landed on Earth and decided to study us as a species. Just in this very kind of dispassionate, objective way, they just started to do, an ethology, study of animal behavior of human beings. And they'd very quickly say, look, this is an amazingly successful species, right? This is the only species on the planet that launches spaceships. One. No one else is coming close. What is it about the behavior of the species that accounts for that? And I think if those alien anthropologists did their work, they'd come to the same conclusions that come out of the discipline of cultural evolution. And I'm going to oversimplify like crazy. It's a bit of a two-part answer. Part number one is that we are the only species on the planet, the only one that cooperates intensely with large numbers of individuals who we are not related to. Now, the social insects do good at the cooperate intensely, but they're literally all members of one big happy family. Chimpanzees and our other close relatives do not cooperate intensely at all. We're the only ones that do that. That's a big part of our success. The other part of our success is that our cultures evolve. We learn faster and acquire new knowledge and amass technologies and develop new tools much, 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 much faster than anything else on the planet. And for me, that was kind of a eureka. Here's this discipline that kind of explains us to me in a very profound way and answers deeply important questions. And then The only tiny little bit of additional momentum I'm trying to provide is to take the insights from that discipline and apply them to the work of evolving your organization's culture. To me, it's a very, very tight fit. We all know that organizations have strong cultures. Here's this discipline, literally called cultural evolution, which, if you apply its insights correctly, I think you learn how to do a better job of evolving your culture quicker, innovating faster, being more agile, whatever, and in the direction that you as the leader of the company want. And then my final eureka, and then I'll shut up, was that what I think the business geeks have done over the course of the 21st century is they have experimented and iterated their way into a set of practices and philosophies for running a company that are close to the ones you would get if you hired a bunch of alien cultural anthropologists. In other words, what I think the geeks have done is they have come up with a way to run a company that is a better fit, not perfect, but a better fit for actual human nature.
There's a lot in there, Andy, that you talked about. So let's unpack this a little bit and get to the bottom of what you mean by culture, because we all sort of think we understand what it means.
Yep.
It's a way of doing things. It's a bunch of traditions,
Exactly.
all of that good stuff. But we oftentimes don't really get beyond that towards like a really crisp definition. So that's one of the things I want to sort of dig into. But you use the word geek at two levels. By the way, I didn't know it was a German word. That was interesting.
Yeah. I learned a ton researching this book. That was one of the things I learned.
Yeah. So, you talk about sort of being a geek. What does it mean to be a geek? Which I sort of, I refer to it as sort of a nerd. But I think, it's sort of similar, right? Sort of obsessive behavior, usually with something technical.
I didn't want to get into the eternal geek nerd debate. You notice I sidestepped that completely in the book.
Yeah.
So I don't want to have that debate. But for me, like you say, I use the word geek a lot. I use it in a couple different ways. When I use it to talk about a person, for me, a geek is an obsessive maverick. So two parts to the definition. Number one, they get obsessed with a hard problem and they can't let it go. I'm listening right now to Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk, and the thing that jumps out to me about that guy is he's on many days the richest person in the world, and he cannot let go the fact that the Tesla factory is not turning out enough cars, or the SpaceX Starlink antenna is not small enough, and he will obsess over those problems until he fixes them. So the first part is just not being able to let go of tough problems. The second part is being willing to embrace unconventional solutions and not really being bound by mainstream opinion or the conventional wisdom or the status quo. So for me, a geek is an obsessive maverick. When I use it as an adjective, we'll talk about, I hope, the norms that are in place at geek companies. For me, a geek company is one that's following those norms.
So before we get to the geek company, who are the other sort of geek leaders that come to mind other than Musk? Off the top of your head.
That you'd pick out pretty quickly. Bezos is an absolute geek. He's just an obsessive maverick. Reed Hastings, the co-founder and longtime founding CEO of Netflix, to me is another one. And in his book, No Rules Rules, which I liked a lot, he talks about how he had run a public company before and run it, in his own words, in a really mediocre way to a really mediocre outcome. And then he sat around and thought about, wait a minute, if I do this again, what am I going to do differently? And Netflix is a very unusual culture, especially in the early 2000s when they put the culture deck together. That very unusual culture for me came out of Hastings' obsessive thinking about how to run a company better. Bill Gates is a self-identified geek. I think Satya Nadella would qualify. Brian Halligan and Dharmesh Shah at HubSpot here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am right now. The geeks are not that hard to identify, especially in tech industries.
By the way, I had Brian Halligan come as a guest speaker in one of my classes because we were discussing HubSpot. This is before they went public. And I didn't tell anyone that Brian was sitting at the back of the class. So you had all these students discussing HubSpot, and then he went up to the front of the room, and I said, "Well, this is the CEO of HubSpot." It was a great session.
He loves that, and to the point, he loves it in a really authentic way. Because I've talked to him about that thing, that pedagogic trick that he uses, and he says, in all sincerity, he says, "Look, I learned something from that. These are really smart people in the room. They have some good ideas. My job at the end is not to get up and say, 'Oh, you're all wrong about everything.'" He treats it as a learning opportunity.
No, he did indeed. I mean, he absorbed everything they said, and then he presented the problems HubSpot had in terms of a nice metaphor of a leaky bucket. He sort of, that's what he reduced it to. It's a leaky bucket.
He's got a great way with words too.
Yeah. So, what about Jensen Huang? Would you regard him as a geek obsessive?
I haven't studied him and his philosophies very deeply, but from the tiny bit that I have observed, absolutely. I have heard him say, even with the stratospheric success that NVIDIA is enjoying right now, he talks about how hard it is to run and grow a company, to start it, to see it to the place where it is now. And he does not talk about it in terms of, oh, it's just a walk in the park. He talks about how difficult it was.
Yeah.
And to the extent that I know about his management philosophy, it is very unconventional. I adore it. I want to study it more deeply and try to fit it into the way I've been thinking about things, or see how well it fits. But provisionally, I would absolutely call Jensen a geek.
So, Andy, let's look at, I guess, geekism at the organizational level, right? And roll back a little bit, because you mentioned that you'd observed that Silicon Valley was winning, right? They were doing something better, and there's this picture in your book that's quite compelling of like 2002, and then I think it's 2022, like 20 years later, and you sort of show how the center of gravity, so to speak, shifted west. Right.
And until I started drawing those visualizations, I truly did not realize it. So the pictures that you're talking about in the book are a visualization I came up with to try to show where the action has been in the American economy in the 21st century. That's kind of a hard thing to get across in a picture or two. Yeah. But let me tell you your listeners about the attempt that I made. I said, okay, let's look at the 100 largest companies in America by market cap. Now, there are certainly other ways to think about the economy, right? But big companies are kind of important in a large economy like America's. So let's take the 100 largest companies by market cap in 2002. So in other words, after the tech bubble of the early 2000s had died down a bit. And all I said was, I'm going to separate them into two clumps. Each bubble is going to be proportional in area to its market cap. And so I'm going to take the 100 bubbles, I'm going to separate them into two clumps. The west coast of the U.S., 3 states, and then all 47 other states. And like you can imagine, when I'm talking about the west coast of the U.S., I'm kind of talking about two very small pieces of real estate. Northern California and the Seattle area, maybe a little bit down in L.A. too, but a very small amount of real estate. And when I did that, about 15 out of those bubbles in 2002 were on the West Coast, and the other 85-ish bubbles were in the other 47 states. In particular, where I am right now on the Northeast of America, that was the heartland. That was where the chemical companies were, the financial services companies, GE, and a lot of the manufacturing base was still there. So it was a very lopsided picture. 15% versus 85%. Then the other thing I did was I shaded the bubbles so that the darker the shading, the younger the company was. And you see a bunch of kind of light gray bubbles on the East Coast, on the other 47 states, and then a small clump of pretty dark bubbles, meaning young companies, on the West Coast in 2002. So I hope that picture is clear in people's minds. Then I redrew it 20 years later for 2022. And the picture is almost balanced. I think about 47% of the total market cap had moved to the West Coast. And there was two equal-sized clumps of bubbles. The biggest bubbles were out west, and the darkest bubbles, the youngest companies, were out west as well. And when you look back at the rest of the American landmass, it was amazing kind of how little action there had been. There was growth, and there were some young companies there, but holy Toledo, had the action moved west. And Vasant, if I drew it again, the distribution would be even more uneven than it was when I put it in the book.
Yeah, no kidding. Just the last couple of years, it would have become even more uneven.
Think about NVIDIA. 2 years ago, it was not not taking over the world. So those bubbles are even bigger and they're even darker. Can I tell you one more thing that I've started doing? I just thought of it, so I didn't get a chance to put it in the book. I'm taking that exact same group of 100 companies, and I'm saying, okay, where was the geographic center of the American economy? If we do weighted average, latitude and longitude for all 100 bubbles, where is it? And in about the 1920s, it was in Ohio because of the Northeast and because of Detroit.
The railroad.
And the railroads.
Yeah.
And then it didn't move very much for the entire 20th century. Essentially, it just wandered around, the Ohio-ish area. Now, 20-ish years later, it's in Utah. It has galloped across the country over the course of the 21st century.
Wow. So let's dig a little deeper into this, because for the last couple of years I've been teaching a class in our Tech MBA program that actually goes to the West Coast. So I travel there with them. We visit a whole bunch of companies, and many of these students sort of ask themselves, do I really want to move west? And everyone who we visit says, well, if you want to be in tech, this is where you want to be. What is it about the West Coast? What is it about the culture there that's created this sort of winning strategy?
The best book that I read to help me answer that question, I guess there are two. One, Annalise Saxenian's work, and
yes.
She comparing the West Coast ecosystem of tech companies versus the one where I am in the Boston area, which was incredibly healthy 30 years ago. And it looked like it might be a horse race between the Boston area and Silicon Valley. Well, one of those horses pulled up lame a long, long time ago. So Annalise Saxenian did a bunch of great work to just talk about the ways that the West Coast ecosystem was looser. People moved among companies more easily. There were not non-competes. There were these structural differences. And she homed in on that. And I got a ton of insight out of that. Another book that I read that really helped me, who John Markoff is. He was the West Coast tech correspondent for the New York Times for a long, long time. Really good reporter, very insightful. He's written several books. The one that made me go eureka was a book he wrote, I forget how long ago, called What the Dormouse Said. And it goes back to the absolute start of the computer industry and the early years of the personal computer industry, starting in the very early 70s in Northern California. And the point that Markoff drove home to me was there was this extremely weird and powerful confluence of different communities. Aerospace engineers, the classic short white sleeve shirt with a pocket protector and a slide rule. Those people were out there. There were also hippies in the deepest sense of the word. There are people who were doing a whole lot of acid and getting some of the engineers to do acid with them to try to find enlightenment. So the hippie culture out there was real, and there was an academic culture with Stanford and Berkeley and other universities out there, and these very and there are entrepreneurs out there too. These very, very different kinds of people all got interested in this thing called the computer at about the same time. And they started to interact with each other in a way that I don't think you see very often. And you really don't see or didn't see back here in the puritanical Northeast. And what Markoff convinced me of is there's something in that brew of button-down engineers and entrepreneurs and academics and hippies that came together and got a flywheel going in the early 70s in Northern California. And I think for me that helps explain why that is still the epicenter of the world's technology generation system. And my whole point in writing the book, I think it's now the epicenter of a flat, better way to run a company. I spend a lot of time out west, and a lot of my best friends live out there. And I had a dinner party with them just a couple of weeks ago, and I said, "This really is America's weirdest major city, isn't it?" And they looked at me like I was an idiot. And they said, "Of course it is. We're out here because we just enjoy this flavor of weirdness." And I think most, if not all of them, were in tech.
Yeah, interesting. So much stuff you said in there, and about the whole sort of cultural revolution. In fact, one of the biggest influences in my life was Woodstock. Which was
Did you go?
Sort of the hippie culture. In fact, I was at a hedge.
Wait, did you go?
I wish, but
We talked about that.
I was
This podcast is
13.
like a very
You
big
know,
tweet
yeah,
tour.
I was 13 at the time, and I was at this hedge fund conference many, many years later in Chicago, and I was sitting with a colleague, and at some point he turns to me and he says, "You're a fucking hippie, aren't you?"
Yeah.
And since then he addresses his emails to me as "Dear FH."
FH.
So so much in there, and you talked about John Markoff, and he has
Yeah.
a really interesting. I loved his writings. He has really interesting. I'm almost sure it was him. An interview with Raj Reddy from Carnegie Mellon, because I was there sort of in the late 70s, early 80s when the Robotics
Wow.
Institute was set up,
So cool.
and Raj Reddy was a student of McCarthy's at Stanford, and he talks about
wow.
sort of the whole AI culture in the early days that was emerging. That was fascinating.
It's important. And I think it's easy to underestimate. There is this tolerance of weirdness, this affinity for it, this inherent kind of looseness. I don't have a better word for it on the tip of my tongue. But a few years back, one of my dearest friends is a woman named Leslie Fine, lives out in San Francisco, and she said to me, "You're coming with us to Burning Man next year." And I said, "No, I'm not. Let me assure you, I am not going to Burning Man with you next year." I said, "Leslie, you've known me for a long time. You're one of my best friends. What are you saying?" And she said, essentially, "Moron, it's exactly because I know you so well that I'm telling you, you need to come do this with us next year and you will get a lot out of it." And so, now I'm a burner, and I go out and I try to fit in with that very freaky week. And I'm super glad that it's something that I've done.
I'm super intrigued about that, Andy. So let's we'll save that for another conversation. But let's dig a little deeper into what the hell this culture is all about. And what is it, right? Because you define sort of these 4 properties of geekism, right? So let's dig into them, because they're very interesting and involve all kinds of things, like how do you allow people to talk back without being assholes, kind of thing, right? So, it's a question of sort of finding the right balance. So, unpeel that for us. Like, what does this culture really mean, and how do these companies find the right balance? In terms of each of those components of culture.
The second part is really important, and I'm glad we're starting off with it, because they don't know. They're always trying to find that balance. And I hope I don't come across as saying in the book or saying in any of the conversations, there's a set of companies who have nailed it and all we have to do is emulate them. Because when I talk to the leaders of these companies, they don't have that flavor of arrogance at all. They don't think that they have found the absolute sweet spot of running a company, and that's going to be a stable sweet spot. They struggle with a lot of the things that leaders at all organizations struggle with. But I think they do it in a different way. But to try to start to answer your question, I want to go back to something you said earlier, that culture is, you said, to you it was a loosey-goosey word or something. And I completely agree. I've been in business academia like you have for a long time. And I realized that whenever anybody said organizational culture and started talking from there, I would start tuning out. I just wasn't engaged by that conversation for a bunch of reasons, but I didn't have any appetite for getting deeper into the academic discussions about organizational culture, in part because I just thought we weren't talking in concrete enough terms. And then I changed my mind about 180 degrees, because I think we have some definitions of culture that we can start with that are rock solid. And so the one I include in the book is from Joe Henrich, who's an anthropologist at Harvard and wrote I think the book that might have been most important for me writing The Geek Way, which is a book called The Secret of Our Success, where he says, essentially, why are we the only spaceship launching species? And then gives a really good answer to it. But so I'm going to use Henrich's definition. And he says, by culture, I mean the large body of practices, techniques, heuristics, tools, motivations, values, and beliefs that we all acquire while growing up, mostly by learning from other people. Now, I want to do 2 things to that definition. I want to take out the while growing up part, because I think we continue to absorb culture from the people around us all throughout our lives. And companies aren't full of teenagers, right? They're where adults hang out. I also want to add one word to Henrik's definitions, because I think he leaves out the word norms, which is an incredibly important word. Every human culture has norms, and I think the right way to think about norms is that they are behaviors that are enforced via community policing. In other words, they're not what the boss necessarily wants. They're the things that if you don't do them, your colleagues have ways of letting you know. And the main way human cultures let people know when they're stepping out of line, when they're not following the norms, is via social exclusion in all of its many manifestations. So norms are the things that you are encouraged to do because you'll be increasingly ostracized or included if you don't. None of this is super controversial. Norms have been around for a long, long time, but I wanted to hinge my discussion of the geek way around norms, because to me they are the biggest things that differentiate geek companies from industrial era companies. And I just use that phrase to talk about the companies following the dominant playbook that got built up over the course of the 20th century about how to run an organization, especially one as it gets bigger and older. I think norms are the key difference, and I think the geek way is based around 4 norms.
I like the notion of the scientific method or evidence as a norm for making decisions. Can you overdo this, though? That is, sticking to norms that don't work anymore?
You can overdo anything. And I think the geeks have a particular failure mode of overdoing this particular norm. But let me try to be precise about what I'm talking about with the norm of science. Like our colleagues, our community will argue endlessly about what the scientific method actually is. You just have an endless debate about the scientific method. There's a philosopher named Michael Strevens who wrote a book called The Knowledge Machine that, again, I relied on really heavily when I was writing The Geek Way, because I think he nails what science actually is. And his answer is a 2-part answer. He says, first of all, science is an endless argument. And that's great. That's to me, that's a huge insight. Science is a dispute. We're trying to get a better understanding of reality, of nature, of how the universe works. We don't agree. In every seminar, Vasant, that you've been in, and me too, an argument breaks out, at least one of them. That's the point of an academic seminar, is to have an argument about what's going on. So the first thing is that the scientific method is an argument. We all know that. We all agree with that on the way in. The second thing, and this is the brilliance, is that there is a ground rule about how we're going to settle that argument. And this is the difficult part, because the ground rule in our world of people who work in universities, researchers, that ground rule is so well understood, it's so internalized that we don't even realize, we don't even have to articulate it. But what Strevens did was articulate it in a way that I found super helpful. He said the ground rule for how we're going to determine who's right, because you believe A and I believe B about the nature of reality, is that we're going to settle it not with experience or expertise or charisma or who went to the fancier school or who's got the Nobel Prize or who's got the really great looking PowerPoint deck. Those are not how we're going to settle it. We are going to settle it with evidence, not even ruthless logic, not even rhetorical brilliance. Evidence. And in particular, when science is working really well, if you believe A and I believe B, we're going to agree in advance on a test, an empirical test, an evidence-based test, where if it goes one way, it's A, and if it goes another way, it's B. And then we're going to go run that test, and we're going to we might argue a bit about it afterward, but at some point, if it's B and you thought it was A, you're going to change your mind. That's kind of how science is supposed to work. So it's an endless argument with a ground rule that disputes will be settled by evidence. And to me, that helps explain why the geeks are so obsessed about data. And, in God we trust, all others bring their data. They're trying to follow the ground rule of science. And like in our world, you're deferential to a Nobel Prize winner who's giving a seminar, but you and I would feel comfortable raising a point of disagreement or objection to a Nobel Prize winner in the room. And I've seen it happen over and over again. That inherent egalitarianism is really, really important. It's very hard to do in most organizations. It's super unnatural. And a lot of very prominent senior high status people do not like to be argued with. It does not feel good to be challenged. But what science says is that's the point. There are going to be challenges. And again, this is an ideal, not a thing that happens all the time in reality. It's going to be inherently egalitarian. And if you're not okay with that, you need to go find someplace else to build your career.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I was having with Jan LeCun, my colleague and friend, when he was getting the Turing Award. And I said, do you have any concerns? And he says, well, the only concern I have is maybe people will stop disagreeing with me as much. And I said, no chance of that.
And Jan, like he's an incredibly clear thinker. So it doesn't surprise me that he would be worried about that. You mentioned that I was talking to Brian Halligan a while back, and he said, I noticed that as I became CEO and as HubSpot got bigger, it wasn't just that my employees wouldn't disagree with me very much. He said, I had trouble getting the truth out of our customers. They're like, oh, yeah, your product's great. Thanks very much. And he said, that's not helpful. I need to know what's not working so I can go make it better for you. We humans, this is part of our human nature. I'm going to keep coming back to this. We are reluctant. We're deeply, deeply gene deep reluctant to challenge senior, dominant, high status people. If you're a chimpanzee and you challenge the alpha, you are going to get a whooping. It's going to become very physical very quickly. Now, we are not chimpanzees, but we are also a social species, and all social mammals are based on these kinds of hierarchies. And to think that we don't have that we're not aware of dominance and we're not reluctant to challenge a dominant, I think that's just wrong. It denies who we are.
So what are some examples off the top of your head of people who've sort of really got this right? The scientific method, it just becomes a process in the company, and some, organizations that have made missteps without realizing it.
I'll give you a geek success story and then a geek failure story. The success story, apparently I'm just going to keep talking about Brian Halligan because I think he's a really impressive leader in a lot of ways. He came to me way back when I was at Harvard, and he said, hey, I want to do some education for HubSpot, which was at the time still just kind of a medium-sized company. And we thought about a curriculum, and then we were going to go deliver it. And the first interesting thing he said was, okay, come with me to the office. We're going to run this by a bunch of the HubSpotters. And I was like, that's pretty egalitarian. Usually, like the exec just walks in to the business school and says, hey, I need a curriculum. And the exec and the faculty brainstorm it, and then we go inflict it on people. Halligan said, no, we're going to go have a discussion about it first. So there were about 20 people in the room, and he and I both talked for a bit about what the curriculum was and what we were trying to accomplish. And Halligan finished up, and he said, so what do you think? And he sat down. And, I've been in enough meetings where that's a cue for the rest of the room to say, great idea, boss, in all kinds of different ways. And instead, this child stood up. He had to be a brand new employee. And the first words out of his mouth, and he wasn't joking, the first words out of his mouth were, there are a couple things I don't like. And then he went on from there. And, it wasn't being a jerk, but he kind of, took our idea and tore it apart a little bit in front of his CEO. And I'm looking around the room going, oh man, this is awkward, isn't it? And I pretty quickly realized I was the only person who found it awkward. You can see when body language changes in a room. We're super attuned to that. I didn't see any changes except in myself. And after the meeting was over, Halligan and I went back to his office, and I said, wow, that was wild. He said, what? I said, the part where that kid challenged you right after you got done talking. And he kind of looked at me with pity, and he said, what kind of company do you think I'm trying to build here? His idea was we're only going to get good ideas if we have an egalitarian way for the best ideas to surface. We have to do things that way. So that's my success story. The failure story, I think this is a really, really sad story about Linus Torvalds at the Linux Foundation, which he founded because he was the originator of the Linux operating system and the whole ecosystem. And he had an informal title inside the foundation of benevolent dictator for life because he was such a towering figure in that community. However, as a very, very geeky person himself, he took the argumentation part of science way too far, and he turned it into abuse is the only word for it. And he had this extent, the Linux mail list is all available, and you can just watch him flame people and be a jerk way beyond humor, way beyond what was called for, just in this really unself-aware, abusive, cruel way. And there was a person named Sage Sharp who was working on, I think they were working on the kernel at Linux. And they were brave enough to call out Torvalds on some of the mailing lists, and they said, Linus, you have to stop acting this way. You're too important to community. We're here volunteering. Nobody deserves to be yelled at in all caps the way that you're doing. We don't even have a code of conduct for the Linux community. And he flamed Sharp. They put something together called the Code of Conflict, which was just an insult to the whole process. And eventually Sharp left the community, which was really bad. Eventually the New Yorker magazine confronted Torvalds with his own behavior, and he left the Linux community. He said, hey, I realize this was wrong and bad. I need to take some time. I've got to step away. I'm not a very self-aware person. I've harmed the community. And he stepped down. So that is the geeks taking their geekiness way too far when argumentation turns into abuse, and when it moves away from what my Harvard colleague Amy Edmondson talks about with such eloquence, psychological safety. That the geeks can ruin psychological safety, and I think it's super important.
By the way, was Linus ever wrong?
There were style questions, but not according to him. You know, there's always debate about how you're going to do something.
I mean, like in a technical sense, right? I mean,
I'm sure he was. Nobody's always right. But, you know, there were, how should we do comments in Linux? I'm making this up. And he said, anyone who does comments in the following way deserves to be, I won't try to even quote it, but it was just so over the top on matters where reasonable people could disagree.
But, you know, when you were talking about failures, I actually thought you might talk about sort of the Coca-Cola fiasco, going from Coke to Coke Classic and back to Coke, because, you know, I sort of got a chuckle out of reading that part.
Didn't that take you down memory lane? You remember that when that happened?
I do.
Our
I remember that.
So long enough. We remember that was weird, man.
Yeah.
But the reason I include the story in the book, it was an epic corporate screw up. Coke changed I'm not making this up. They changed the formula for Coca-Cola, which had been around for about a century, I think, by that point. And the cocaine had been taken out in the 1920s, and it had been the same ever since. Coke, out of the blue, announced they were changing the formula for Coca-Cola. And the world reacted about like you'd expect, and they had to roll it back within a matter of months. It was a massive corporate self-inflicted wound. The reason I tell the story, though, is it was an evidence-based decision. You remember the Pepsi challenge, where you'd have this little sip of Coke, a little sip of Pepsi. It was an A/B test.
Yeah, I do. In fact, that was shortly after the sort of No Coke Pepsi episode in Saturday Night Live, right?
Yeah. So there was this A/B test that went on, and sure enough, people preferred the taste of Pepsi over Coke in a small sip. And the CEO of Coke at the time, Robert Gozzetta, looked at that and they replicated it internally. And he and a very small team of execs said, oh, holy cow, we got to do something about this. So they came up with a different formula for Coke that was a little bit sweeter, a little bit more like Pepsi, and they rolled this out across the world. Now, you could say, wait a minute, I thought we were supposed to make decisions based on evidence, and you are. But I think the team at Coke that was responsible for that incredibly bad decision forgot the arguing part. Because if they had floated this idea to any decent cross-section of their colleagues, there would have been people at Coke saying, wait a minute, you are going to take an actual deep piece of Americana and mess with it because of an A/B test involving an ounce of beverage? Are you nuts? Are you going to take this? Are you going to jeopardize this brand because by a small margin for a sip, people prefer the taste of something else? Are you actually nuts? So they didn't argue about it, and they did a flawed A/B test, and by not arguing about it, they blew that up into a terrible decision.
Great story, Andy. What a fiasco. So, Andy, you talk about the fact that geek organizations perform better.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a pretty bold claim, right? To actually link it, to link it to performance. So what's the evidence for that? And what would be some sort of competing theories to your evidence?
Let me give you a couple different lines of evidence, because you're right. I'm making a really large claim, and it's not a claim that I can prove in a way that would stand up to the scrutiny of our colleagues yet. But let me say there are about three different lines of evidence that I can bring. The first is what we've already talked about, that the concentration of that value creation in the modern economy at a large scale is an incredibly concentrated phenomenon. Most of it is happening in a couple of very, very small patches of real estate that are mainly on the West Coast of the United States and run by people who come out of the same ecosystem that we've been talking about. So it's very hard to argue that something hasn't shifted in the economy in the 21st century. And the obvious rebuttal to that is, tech is digital tech is the big story of the business world. The part of the country that's best at digital tech should be creating a lot of value. Yeah, okay. To me, that dodges the question of why are they better at tech? They don't have the patents. It's not the only place that knows about, again, Moore's law and network effects. It's not the only place where you can mine silicon. None of that makes any sense. In addition to which, I don't think that the story is a story about the high-tech industry. That industry label does not make any sense to me. We use that label to describe a different phenomenon, the phenomenon that I would call the rise of the geek company. We've talked a little bit about Netflix. Netflix is by no real definition a, quote, high-tech company. They don't sell microchips or cloud computing services. They're exactly as high-tech as HBO is. They're in the same industry, literally. And they're mopping the floor with the incumbents in that industry. When Netflix just said that they were going to start producing their own content, they're going to become like a Hollywood studio, Hollywood establishment laughed at them. There was a famous interview with the then CEO of Time Warner, and the reporter asked him what he thought of Netflix coming into their industry. And he said, I love this quote, he said, "It's a little bit like, is the Albanian army going to take over the world? I don't think so." I looked up just the other day, the market capitalization of Netflix is, I believe, now more than 10 times greater than the market capitalization of Warner Brothers Discovery, which is a combination of HBO and Warner Brothers and a couple other things. Netflix is substantially more valuable a company right now than Disney. This is the Albanian army taking over the world. I can't talk about that as a tech story. That doesn't make any sense to me. It's a story about a different way to run a company that works better even in an industry like entertainment. I could tell very similar stories about the car industry. I can't call Tesla any more high-tech company than General Motors. They're just better at doing things that involve a lot of technology. Why are they better? What do they do that's different? I give a lot of examples in the book of how geeky a company Tesla is in a lot of ways. Same story about SpaceX, same story about Stripe. So the industry explanation doesn't mean very much to me. There has to be something else going on. Then the second main piece of evidence I would give is when you look at where people actually want to work. And I got a couple different lines of evidence about this in the book. These companies that we're talking about have created some of the most desirable, attractive places to work in the economy. And part of the reason why, it's not just because you can make a lot of money, it's because, according to some pretty good evidence, they have actually succeeded better than most other industries or any other industries so far at creating work environments that actually do feature empowerment and autonomy and responsibility and these things that we've been talking about forever and ever. I want to say this super clearly. They're not perfect.
And actually, they actually expect you to sort of move around, right? I mean, in fact, I think Reid Hoffman's book, he sort of talked Tour of Duty, right? He talks about that you should actually sort of expect people will leave you and move on to something, and that's sort of it's even part of the culture, which I thought was sort of interesting in his book.
But when you look at how employees talk about working at these companies versus how employees in finance or professional services or manufacturing talk about working at their companies, it's very different. And again, these companies are not perfect. They have screwed up their cultures, make mistakes. Yes. In general, these are some of the most attractive places to work in the modern economy. So those are the three main lines of evidence that I would give you or any of our colleagues about that. Look at where the value creation has been happening. Look at a couple of the case studies, and they don't fit any classic high-tech technology creation pattern. And then look at what people are saying about working there. And I hope that would convince an observer that there's something really interesting going on. The book is about my explanation for what that is. It's not the final word. I'm sure we're going to learn more as time goes by.
So say a little bit more about this, and you talk about this data collected by the SULs, that actually sort of measures geekiness because it's hard to measure this thing, right? No organization announces that we're 90 on a geek scale. So
And if they did, I wouldn't believe them.
yeah, exactly. So
Why should I?
so I thought that was sort of intriguing. So say a little bit more about how that stuff was measured.
As I was writing the book, I came across this wonderful body of research done by two brothers named Don and Charlie Sull. I did my doctorate with Don Sull 3,000 years ago, and they realized that we actually had a new ability to consistently assess corporate cultures and to look at a bunch of different cultures in the same way. And the reason we could do that is because we now have a lot of employee reviews of the companies where they work, thanks to Glassdoor and sites like that. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, that might not be a perfect way to measure culture, but it ain't bad. Go ask the people who work at these companies and see what they voluntarily say about working at these companies. So the Sulls did a machine learning analysis of corporate culture where they trained the model to recognize if people were saying positive or negative things about a bunch of different aspects of working at a company. And the three that I was most interested in were agility, execution, and innovation, because to me, those are very, very closely tied to performance. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that when you combine those three and look at what people who work at different companies are saying, the companies that are clustered out on the West Coast and in Northern California, they are substantially higher on that trifecta of execution, innovation, and agility in the minds of the people that work at these companies, compared to what equivalent people at automotive companies say, financial services companies, healthcare companies. These geeky companies are just head and shoulders above.
So I was intrigued by another data point there as well, which suggested that these geeky companies score low on customer and sort of interpersonal stuff. Collaboration, right?
Yeah.
So what's the deal there?
The customer one is harder for me to answer. And I think I asked Don this question, and he said a lot of these companies have two different customer groups. So for Uber, is the customer the driver or the passenger? Yeah, okay. He said a lot of these companies don't have comparatively many frontline employees, less than Disney would, for example. So maybe they're just farther away from the customer. I find that a puzzling finding because I think I get taken care of really well as a customer of a lot of these companies. The collaboration one is actually a lot easier for me to understand. These geek companies are a lot less fond of collaboration and coordination and communication and cross-functional integration than the companies of the industrial era were. You and I were around for the era of business process engineering, which was all about defining in advance all the different ways functions were going to talk to each other and work together. And what the geeks try pretty hard to do instead is build what I would call modular organizations where teams are pretty small, pretty self-contained. You interface with them in pretty well-defined ways, and then they're left on their own to try to accomplish their goals. And they're not subject to endless amounts of communication, coordination, integration, checking in, updates, give me a heads up on this kind of thing. They've worked very hard to modularize their company. Now, this is not universal across successful tech companies at all. But if you look at Amazon, for example, Bezos and company tried, starting in the late 90s, they realized that was what they decided that was what they needed to do. And they work like crazy to make their teams actually independent. There's an amazing quote from Bezos that I included in The Geek Way, where according to one of his lieutenants, he said, if we want to make Amazon a place where builders can build, we have to stop all of the communicating. I think that's a profound insight. That's super geeky. That's super far from the mainstream.
The part about sort of low customer focus gave me a chuckle because, I teach a class on systematic investing, and it must have been about 2017. I told my class, I said, I don't really believe in humans making calls, but I'm going all into NVIDIA and Google because I believe NVIDIA is sort of at the center of AI, and Google because they don't give a shit about their customers. Because they don't even have a customer service. Have you ever tried calling Google? Because I actually tried calling Google, and they told me to come back, when they were less busy. I was like, wow, what a business model, right? Where It's like, they just are focused on building a really good product, and, like customers will come. So,
Yeah.
that was a chuckle.
But at the same time, though, Amazon is an absolutely customer-obsessed company.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to come back to finance, Andy. What's happened? Like, where did Wall Street lose it? Or maybe that's too harsh of a statement.
That's harsh in some ways, because we remember the financial crash and the panic that went along with that during the Great Recession. You can make an argument that part of what happened there was that Wall Street got a little too innovative with some of their products, and I think there's some truth to that. I am not sure I want a crazy innovative financial services industry. It's systematically important for the economy. If Amazon goes out of business, I would be really unhappy, but the economy wouldn't grind to a halt. If gigantic banks go out of business, then we have a systemic problem for the economy. So I'm not sure I want the world's most crazy, innovative, risk-taking financial sector. I think we might have got a dose of that. I think crypto gives us another chapter in the story of what happens when we let the innovators have a little bit too much freedom.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when I was on Wall Street, it was a relatively freewheeling kind of an environment, right? You could, I mean, AI in the 90s, right? And that was pretty innovative, because they felt like there was something there, and they were, free to take that risk. I guess it's a structural problem, is what you're saying, right? The regulators have come down on them and said, we really don't want you to take risk, right? We want you to be in a dull, boring business, lending money and doing sort of custody and all that kind of stuff, which itself will probably get eaten away by sort of blockchain and new technologies. So,
and I'm not going to position myself as an expert on the finance industry or the role of finance in an economy at all. But I do think Milton Friedman was onto something when he said you got to regulate banks, because when they go broke, the entire economy is in deep, deep trouble. As a sector, they've got this systematic importance. But I do think that even if we want our banks to be really conservative, I think they're letting us down as customers in a lot of ways. Because whenever I want to go back and remember what the web was like in, 2003, I just go visit the website of any financial services company where I do business. Because it feels to me like that's about the last time they got a real overhaul to their online presence. And it's the only set of companies that I interact with at all where someone with a straight face says, okay, to execute this relatively routine transaction that you're talking about, you need to send us a fax. And I try not to lose my temper with customer service people. They're just trying to do their job. I think the last time I actually lost my temper was when somebody told me that I had to go find a fax machine and send them a fax to transfer my money over to some other place. That's still going on in financial services. And there's no good excuse for that. I think what's going on is that there has not been a lot of disruptive innovation from Silicon Valley, from the tech sector. There have been attempts, but it feels to me like finance and financial services are protected by this incredibly dense thicket of innovation that has been keeping a lot of would-be innovators out, with a couple really important exceptions like Stripe, a company that I mentioned earlier. I interviewed Patrick Collison, the CEO, for the book, and we learned a ton.
Good stuff. So, Andy, before we wrap up, what's your advice to young people and how they should think about their future in this emerging world of AI?
The first thing is calm down at least a little bit, because now in this era of generative AI, we're going through another cycle of, oh my heavens, this powerful technology is going to take all the jobs and there won't be anything left for anybody to do. I don't believe that for a second. I think people who are really good at working with generative AI, who are very good at working with other human beings, who are creative, who know how to frame a question or identify an opportunity, who know how to do what you just said, which is critical thinking, which is easy to say and very, very hard to teach. I don't think we know very much about how to teach critical thinking. Those skills are going to be in demand for a long, long time to come, to say nothing of, man, if you're a good plumber, you're going to have work for a long, long time to come. The robot plumber is a long way away. And it feels to me like we've over-valorized or overemphasized white-collar knowledge work at the expense of other ways to earn a good living and contribute in really important ways to a healthy society. So the first thing is calm down. The other thing is I'm going to outsource a bit of my advice to Mark Andreessen, who says if you work at a place where speaking truth to power is discouraged, get out as quickly as you can. You can find places to work where there is a sense of egalitarianism, where you can speak truth to power, where there is psychological safety and the great geek norm of openness that I talk about. Those organizations are out there. And I think life is too short to have to bite your tongue all day, every day at work.
Well said. So, since you talked about AI and generative AI, do you feel like we're in a hype cycle, but somehow this time is different? I've seen a few sort of hype and bust cycles in
more
my
than a few, right?
in my career in AI, but this one just seems different. I mean, I sense a hype cycle, but it's different. How do you see it?
There's clearly some hype going on. But generative AI is a profound technology. This notion that in a self-supervised way, these technologies, especially as we learn to build them better, and especially as we make them bigger, these are very, very scale sensitive phenomena and technologies. Their ability to extract very subtle patterns from huge amounts of data and use those to generate things that we humans have never come up with, but that work with us and make sense to us. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. We're doing it with language right now. We're starting to see it being done with music and photos and videos. That's not going to stop there. Are we going to see it done with proteins? Are we going to see it done with medicines? Are we going to see it done with architecture and design? I think we're going to see all of these things. I've talked about AI as kind of a colleague before. Now the colleague aspect of it to me is becoming a lot more real and a lot more immediate. I don't know exactly what form it's going to take, but I have learned that I am no longer surprised at being astonished. And I actually think that's really cool.
So I want to run an idea by you and see what you think. So I've in my tech innovation class that I taught a couple of months ago, where I took people to the West Coast, we actually visited NVIDIA, and one of the papers I asked them to read was one of my own called "The Paradigm Shifts in AI," where I make the case that AI has gone from an application to a general purpose technology.
Oh yeah,
and if in fact that's the case, then it's a whole new ball game. And I sort of draw the analogy with electricity and the emergence of General Electric in 1892 and how it dominated, for the next 100 years. How do you look at AI? I mean, do you see it as a general purpose technology, or am I just sort of imagining this? How do you look at it?
I absolutely do, and I just wrote a report a while back in collaboration with Google, trying to make the economic case that generative AI in particular fills all the requirements for a general purpose technology, and therefore we should expect to see it roll out like previous ones have done. I'll tell you how right you are. A really good analogy here, I think, is to electricity, because a couple facts are important. Number one is that the lag between the appearance of the technology and the productivity boost from the technology can be a long lag. It was 20 or 30 years in the case of electricity. I don't think it's going to be that long for generative AI. Part of the reason that lag was so long was that we had to do some really deep rethinking and reimagination of what was possible. To make that concrete, in the age of steam power, a factory was a tall, narrow building with a big steam engine in the basement, and then a bunch of shafts and pulleys and things to distribute the power to all the machines. And when electricity came along, it offered pretty immediate cost savings. So factory owners said, oh, this is kind of a no-brainer. And they took out the steam engine and they put in one great big electric motor in the basement of the same building. And they said, ta-da, we've electrified. And that was true. That's not interesting. What's interesting was when the weirdos started showing up in the world of factories and manufacturing. And they said, wait a minute, why stop at one? And then the incumbent said, okay, fine, we'll do 2 or 3 or whatever. And they said, no. And the weirdo said, no. You could do things like you could put one on the ceiling and you could have an overhead crane, or You could make the parts move on some kind of belt that would convey them around. And this was crazy talk. And the weirdo started saying at some point in the future, you could have a separate electric motor on every machine in the factory. And this blew the minds of the incumbents. The debates went back and forth in the journals of the day for about 20 years about, will we ever get there? Is that the right end state? And in retrospect, that sounds ridiculous. But to me, it drives home how hard the reimagination of things is when you stand there as an incumbent, when you have the status quo and the status quo bias. It's very hard for me to see all the different ways that generative AI and the rest of the AI toolkit are going to reshape how companies do their thing. But the way companies do their thing is going to be reshaped by this technology. And I predict it's the geeks who are going to lead the way with that.
Indeed. Yeah, no. I tell my students when they worry about what will we do in the age of AI, I'm like, are you kidding? You are limited only by your imagination at this point, right?
And I agree completely. And I think one of the hardest things is to let go of the status quo, to let go of what you know, what you believe, what your unexamined assumptions are, not just because the incentives aren't lined up very often for deep change, but because it's very hard for our minds to do. Our minds are status quo preservers, and getting away from that is really hard.
Indeed. No, there's comfort in the status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Andy, thanks so much for this conversation. Fascinating. Really enjoyed reading your book, and good luck with it.
Thanks. It was a pandemic project and a labor of love. I'm super happy it's out there in the world. If people have anything, if they read The Geek Way and want to talk, I try to be easy to find.
Awesome. Good stuff, Andy. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you.